The Chicago Bears got to see the top offensive line prospects work out at the NFL Combine over the weekend, and it restarted the annual argument over arm length for offensive tackles like Will Campbell, Kelvin Banks, and Armand Membou.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lauren Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1, and you can follow the podcast at Locked On Bears on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and the Locked On Bears YouTube channel, where you can keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook. Right now, new customers can get $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. On the show today, we look at what the NFL Combine revealed about some of these top offensive line prospects in the NFL draft and how it aligns with where the Bears are picking, not only in the first round, but that's obviously the primary focus, but also later on in this draft. We'll talk about the great debate over LSU tackle Will Campbell's arm length and whether that means he's got to play guard in the NFL and if that means he's not worth the 10th overall pick or how teams are going to evaluate that. We'll look at some of the other tackles that may end up in that conversation for the 10th overall pick, like Kelvin Banks from Texas or Armand Membou from Missouri. But then we'll also look more broadly at the depth of this draft class, particularly on the interior, where the Bears can find some really good guards and centers in the second and third round, and certainly even later on in this draft, some names to like in this class. But everyone wanted to see how LSU's Will Campbell would come in and measure, and obviously perform as well, but the measurements of this combine to get a sense of, okay, how long are his arms? How big are his hands? What's his height and weight? And then, how well can he move for that size? Because some teams have specific thresholds. Well, they'll just say, if an offensive tackle's arms aren't a certain length, then the arms are just going to be too short, and we don't want offensive tackles to have short arms. Teams feel like those tackles are at too much of a disadvantage at the pro level, where defensive ends and edge rushers tend to be a lot longer than interior pass rushers. And so it's the tackles that have short arms that tend to be moved inside to guard, where the defensive tackles tend to have shorter arms, but there's also less space in open space for that arm length to create more separation for that pass rusher. And the same is true in run defense as well. It's not purely a pass rushing, pass protection question. It has a factor in the running game as well, but it tends to be more visible and more of an issue in pass protection. And so Will Campbell goes through the measurements along with, all of the other offensive line prospects at the NFL draft. And he comes in with arms that are 32 and 5/8 inches long. And of course, that number on its own probably doesn't mean very much, but a lot of teams' threshold is 33 inches. His is 32 and 5/8. So he comes in 3/8 of an inch shorter than that hypothetical threshold for some teams at 33 inches. Generally, the longer the arms, the more distance you can create between you and the opposing pass rusher, and that you want the guys with the longest possible arms, because if your arms are longer than the guy across from you, you can make contact first and win your one-on-one rep. Will Campbell's hands also a little bit small at 9.5 inches, but plenty of size at almost 6'6", 319 pounds. And Campbell, of course, has a really strong day on the drills that he did participate in. He ran a 4.98 40-yard dash, which is good for a 320-pound player. Vertical jump of 32 inches, broad jump of 9'5". Generally looked like a pretty good athlete, just shorter arms and slightly small hands. And so all of a sudden, that blows up the discourse again of, is he a guard? Is he a tackle? Because in some draft analysts' eyes, he is a blue-chip left tackle prospect who may be drafted as early as 4th overall by the New England Patriots. Like the first team that isn't going to go quarterback or maybe pass rusher and Abdul Carter. Like if those guys are gone, you grab an offensive tackle like Campbell. If you see him as that top camp, think about Joe Alt last season. Like it's in the eyes of some evaluators, he can be that guy. For other people, there are questions about the arm length. Was already a little bit of a question, but also I think in his ability to have clean reps in pass protection in terms of his footwork and staying in with his weight over his feet and not like getting too far in front of himself, and someone who needs to work on improving the timing of his punches a little bit. Like there's always some room for improvement. And for me, like how he sets up versus speed rushers is something that I still have some concerns about. We're nitpicking. He's obviously clearly a first-round talent at the offensive line, whether it's at tackle or guard. He's a very good tackle prospect. But if we want to start to put him in the top 5 of this draft before the Bears are on the clock, then for me, you've got to be like someone like Joe Alt last season, and I don't quite see that for Will Campbell. So if we start to apply this to the Chicago Bears, then maybe the short arms keep teams from taking him in the top 5. Maybe that helps him fall down a little bit farther. So if he's there on the clock with the 10th overall pick, do the Bears take him? And I think there's a couple of things to consider here. First of all, I don't think for Ryan Poles and for Ben Johnson that the exact arm length number is going to be a deal breaker here. That, okay, because his arms are 3/8 of an inch lower than 33 inches, does that make him a bad player all of a sudden? No, it's going to be about the tape. Obviously, you would prefer them to be longer, but some players can make up for a lack of arm length. He would not have the shortest arms of starting offensive tackles in football, but he would be one of just 8 starting offensive tackles in the NFL that have arms under 33 inches. The other names out there, Bernhard Raimann from the Colts, who Campbell has gotten compared to a little bit, Caleb McGarry from the Falcons, who you might remember as someone was linked to the Bears at times entering free agency that year, but obviously stayed with the Atlanta Falcons, so didn't really become a clear option there. But then Kendall Lamb from Miami, Luke Gadecki from the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and then Braden Smith, who's also with the Colts, starts opposite Bernhard Raimann on that offensive line. Those guys all have arms that are under 33 inches. I think McGarry might be the only first-round pick in that group off the top of my head. The rest of them are second-round picks and later in their respective draft classes. McGarry was the 31st overall pick, just barely snuck into that first round. But I think Luke Gadecki and Bernhard Raimann were second-round picks. Braden Smith, I think, was a day 2 guy, and Kendall Lamb was later on in this draft. So clearly, NFL teams don't tend to prefer this length of arm. It felt like we had this same conversation with the Bears 2 years ago. In 2023 with Peter Skoronski from Northwestern, right? A very talented, skilled left tackle, but his arms came in at 32 1/4. So even shorter than Will Campbell's, about half an inch shorter than, 3/8 of an inch shorter than Will Campbell. So relatively, we're talking about fractions of an inch here. They're not drastically different, all things considered. But the Bears had a chance to draft Skoronski at 10 if they had wanted to. They passed on Skoronski and took Darnell Wright instead. Skoronski goes 1 pick later to the Tennessee Titans, and the Titans end up moving him inside to guard, and he's been, I think, okay for them. Not elite, but not terrible either, but still very early in his career, absolutely. But we do have that immediate, I don't know if you call it track record or precedent of Ryan Poles preferring a longer offensive tackle in Darnell Wright than a shorter offensive tackle in Peter Skoronski. What changes now, though, is that it's not Matt Eberflus's staff, it's Ben Johnson's staff. And the Bears coaches now may have slightly different preferences and evaluations of these prospects. And certainly it's not purely an arm length that decides whether the Bears want to take this guy. Like maybe they just didn't like Skoronski's tape as much, but they could like Will Campbell's tape a lot more and be willing to take a shorter armed offensive tackle if they like the player and the tape better, regardless of what the exact arm length measurement is here. And I think that's ultimately the lesson, where I don't think the arm length thing will drastically change how the Bears evaluate this player. You either see him as a blue chip, can't miss offensive line prospect worthy of being taken in the top 10, or you don't. And that's what determines whether Chicago will take him, not whether his arms were 3/8 of an inch longer to meet some threshold that some teams may or may not abide by. So that to me is where the conversation starts with Will Campbell. And it's not as though everything changed because the combine measurement came in, but some of the other guys at offensive tackle had strong combines and maybe playing themselves into that 10th overall pick conversation, where whether Will Campbell is there or not, the Bears could prefer a different prospect there, like they did with Darnell Wright over Peter Skoronski 2 years ago. So we'll take a closer look at Kelvin Banks and Armand Membou next on Locked On Bears. This episode of Locked On Bears is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, America's #1 sportsbook. And when the game tips off, the NBA action is just getting started, and there's no better place to get in on it than with FanDuel, because FanDuel lets you place live bets throughout the game. So even if you miss the opening tip-off, you can bet on a fourth quarter comeback or who's going to make that clutch play at the end of the game. You can always stay in the action. If you're looking for a bigger payout, you can even combine your live bets into a same game parlay. Or if you want to bet on the NFL draft, you can currently bet on who's going to be the number 1 overall pick. And as we get closer to draft day, FanDuel will have more odds for which quarterback gets taken first, who's going to go to what teams, and maybe even who the Bears take with the 10th overall pick. Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. That's FanDuel.com for your shot at $150 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. Will Campbell is pretty clearly the consensus top offensive lineman in this draft, but there are other offensive linemen that are in this conversation, and there certainly are people that have other linemen higher than Will Campbell, people who are especially maybe see him as a guard, and so you say, well, if he's a guard, he's not worth a top 10 pick, so one of these other tackles that's more of a true offensive tackle maybe is then higher on a big board in this draft. It's not to say that Campbell is some perfect can't-miss prospect. I have some questions about Will Campbell, just like you have questions about just about every player in any given draft class. But I think there are a couple guys that may also be in this conversation for the 10th overall pick. It's Kelvin Banks from Texas and Armand Membou from Missouri. Those two guys to me are similarly talented prospects. I'd probably put Membou over Banks personally. And I think the callback to the 2013 NFL draft is an apt one here. 2023. Not because the prospects are exactly the same, but I remember in that 2023 draft class, right? That was the year where you had, I also want to go to 2020. Was it 2024 then with Paris Campbell from Ohio State? Was that 2022? I'm losing my draft classes here. No, that was 2023. Okay, good. I was missing it up here. Yeah, so that was the year you had Paris Campbell from Ohio, or Paris Johnson from Ohio State at the 6th overall pick to the Cardinals. You had Peter Skoronski in that draft. You had, of course, Darnell Wright. You had Broderick Jones from Georgia. And I remember in that draft class, for a while there was this debate about, like, how do you rank these 4 guys? And I think we were all more or less settling on Paris Johnson as the top guy, and whether the Bears could get Paris Johnson to be their left tackle with the 10th overall pick. In that draft, he goes at 6, so okay, he's off the board there. But in the pre-draft process leading up to that draft, towards the end, there were rumors that some teams had Broderick Jones as the number 1 offensive tackle in that draft class, ahead of Paris Johnson. There were rumors that some teams had Darnell Wright as the top offensive tackle. Like, all 4 of those guys, depending on what team you talk to, maybe had them in a slightly different order. And it ends up going Johnson, Wright, Skoronski, Jones. And I think there was another couple of guys later on, like Anton Harrison from Oklahoma, later in that first round. But it was not a very rigid, clear hierarchy of here's 1, 2, 3, 4 in an order that everyone agrees on. And I think that's going to be the case this year with Will Campbell and Kelvin Banks and Armand Membou and a couple of these other guys that are at least in this conversation as early to mid first round picks. Josh Simmons from Ohio State, Ariante Ursiri from Minnesota, Josh Carnley from Oregon, maybe even Tyler Booker from Alabama. These guys could all be potential first round guys. But I think it's really Campbell, Membou, and Banks at the top. Simmons is coming off an injury, but has really good tape, so he could get in this conversation. Absolutely. But for me, somebody like Membou is really intriguing with the 10th pick because not only did he test really well, but I really like his tape to back it up. He played right tackle at Missouri, so you'd either have to move him to left tackle or move Darnell Wright to left tackle if you were going to draft them for the Chicago Bears, but absolutely lit up the combine. It's worth noting both Banks and Membou came in with arm lengths that were less than an inch longer than Will Campbell. Membou and Banks were both at 33.5 inches compared to 32 5/8. So 7/8 of an inch longer. And all of a sudden, that doesn't mean that they're just all of a sudden better offensive tackles because their arms were about an inch longer, but it is some level of a difference then when you combine that with the tape and with the athletic ability, because Membou ran a 4.91, 34-inch vertical, 9'7", broad jump, really good athletic numbers there. A little bit smaller of a frame at just 6'4", which is funny, right? Just 6'4", but boy, does he move really, really well. A fluid mover, really good body control, someone who can get out in space in the running game, closes windows fast in pass protection, so guys aren't going to necessarily blow by him there. And I think it's those movement skills that make you feel like he could potentially move over to left tackle just fine and handle that transition in the NFL. If anything for him, I wonder about his ability to anchor sometimes and sort of absorb when pass rushers go speed to power there, and just making sure that he has better placement with his punches. Sometimes he can kind of get outside of the frame. These guys are never perfect prospects, but I think Membou has a lot to like as a really high ceiling player, because Membou, Banks, and Campbell have all kind of had this are they guard or tackle conversation, because none of them have the freakishly long arms. None of them have the perfect ideal frame as a tackle. But I think in the eyes of a lot of people, Membou and Banks solidified themselves as tackle, whereas Campbell left that door open a little bit more. Banks wasn't nearly as freakish of a combine tester, but I think there's something to be said about how they move in the open field drills, and these timing numbers aren't necessarily all that important. So somebody like Kelvin Banks, he runs a 5.18 in the 40. He'll get a little bit slow in the 40. Vertical and broad jump were closer to average there. But even he ran the shuttle and the 3-cone, and they were fine. But I don't know that those make or break how good an offensive lineman is to me. Do I need them to run 40 yards faster than everybody else? I mean, sure, it's nice. Any of these things are nice if they're a little more explosive or a little fast. But all I want to know is how are their feet, how are their hands, how well can they block the person in front of them? And the 3-cone drill and the short shuttle don't necessarily tell me a ton about that. Banks, to me, needs a little bit more work than somebody like Membou or even Will Campbell by comparison. I think he can get off balance a little bit and lunge more. He's a player who looks better to me moving forward than backwards, in terms of Banks is someone who can run block and can move guys off of the ball. And when Texas would run play action, where he can kind of go forward first and sort of cell run and then get back into pass protection, if he can initiate that contact, then and be the first one to make the punch, then he's pretty set. But when he's going backwards and kind of waiting for you to come to him, that's when it's a little bit less consistent for Banks. So I think he needs a little bit more work, and I don't know if I love him with the 10th overall pick per se at this point. But at the same time, all of this conversation is about who's there and who's available, right? It's about these offensive linemen versus the pass rushers that may or may not still be on the board at that point. Does someone like Mason Graham from Michigan fall down to 10 with some of his combine numbers? Or somebody like the pass rusher like Shamar Stewart or Michael Williams or James Pierce or Mike Green, is one of these guys the best player available on the board? It feels like the Bears are going to have a couple options on the O-line and a couple options on the D-line, plus running back like Ashton Genty is going to be in this conversation as well. There's a lot of different directions they can go, and it's about feeling out who is truly the best player available on the draft board, because this pick at 10 is not about filling the biggest need in 2025. It's about getting the best player for at least the next 5 years of their rookie contract, plus ideally another 3 to 5 years on a contract extension after that. This is a 5 to 10 year investment in this player. So just because you might need a pass rusher more, you might need a guard more, if that blue chip left tackle is going to be a 10-year starter for you, and you can trust that player is going to be better than any of the pass rushers that you see in the draft, then take the player that you think is going to be the best player. But to me, I'm only taking a player at 10 if they're going to be a left tackle. If the Bears see Will Campbell as a guard, I don't want to take that at the 10th overall pick. There's not enough value in drafting a guard with a 10th overall pick when you can get guards that are very good starters in the second and third and maybe even fourth rounds of most drafts, including this draft, that'll have a similar impact on your team, even if maybe they're not quite as good, but their impact ends up being similar just due to the nature of the positional value here. So I want to look more closely at the depth of this draft class and how that plays out with what the Bears need to do with that 10th overall pick next on Locked On Bears. The Bears can absolutely find starting caliber guards and center, absolutely with their 2 second-round picks and definitely with their third-round pick. And you never know, beyond that, there's opportunities where every year we see guards go in day 3 of the draft that end up starting as a rookie and still actually playing pretty darn well. You don't have to look any farther than just this past season. I know we're talking about fourth round pictures, so I don't need to belabor the point here. But somebody like from the San Francisco 49ers, they drafted, gotta find Dominic Pooney with the 86th overall pick and ended up starting, I think, all 17 games for them. In the fourth round, Tanner Bortolini starts games for the Colts at center. Cedric Van Pran for the Buffalo Bills gets in some games. They're like a bunch of these later round picks. You can find guys that are football players and not just projects that are going to take a couple years for them to get up to speed there. You can't always do as much with tackle there. It tends to be more guards and centers. Yeah, you can find tackles, but your tackles tend to be later in the draft tend to be more like Karan Amagaji in terms of projects that need a little bit more work as you go through this process. But when I think about where the Bears are with 2 early second-round picks, you're in a great spot there to get guys that were borderline first-round talents that just slipped out of the first round. So you got 39 and 41 in this draft. This is the 7th pick of the second round and the 9th pick of the second round. And you should have a pretty good shot at quite a few good interior offensive linemen. So there's guys like the high end there, I think, is like Tyler Booker at Alabama or Donovan Jackson from Ohio State that may end up being first-round guys, but if they could fall in the second round, you'd feel really good about it. But guys that are going to be in this second-round range, or even where the Bears pick in the third round at 72nd overall. Somebody like Gray Zabel from North Dakota State, maybe having the best pre-draft process of anybody. Really strong at the Senior Bowl and looked like almost like a first-round caliber player. Has a really strong combine as well, and you feel like, man, Gray Zabel played tackle at North Dakota State, but was playing guard and center in the drills and did so in the combine as well. And he looks like a day one starter on the interior there. Someone like, I can never say his last name, but the Arizona tackle, Jonah Savaiinaea. He's a Samoan offensive lineman for them. Played tackle for them. Could play tackle in the NFL. Could also end up playing guard in the NFL. I think he would be a good spot for him in this range. Marcus Membou from Purdue was a tackle who's going to kick inside the guard in all likelihood, in this second to third round range. Or like Georgia center Jared Wilson. I think it was absolutely athletic freak at the combine here. People who can move that fast for someone that size are so valuable, especially at the center position when you're trying to have some difficult reach blocks in the running game, when you're trying to hit those outside zones and you got to get to defensive tackles who's in front of you and get around him. Man, it would be exciting to see an athlete like Jared Wilson at center and even like an athlete like Armand Membou at tackle. Then you'd have an offensive line that can move and can get out in front and just be faster than all the defensive linemen on the other side, or Tate Ratledge from Georgia as well. There's a couple of different Georgia guys in this draft that are in that second to third round range that, man, there's 4 or 5. We just named, I think, 7 different guys that are potentially second to third round players where the Bears are drafting there that are all fully capable of coming in as a rookie and starting. And sure, they wouldn't be as good as Will Campbell. But what's the difference between say Will Campbell becomes a top 10 guard in the NFL? That would be a great career for him. And then let's say this guy you get in the second round becomes a top 32 guard in the NFL. Like still an upper half of starters, right? But is a very good player, but never a Pro Bowl. Like what's the difference for your offensive line if your guard is a Pro Bowler or just a very good starter? Like how much of a difference does that make for your team? If you replaced, say, Tevin Jenkins with Trey Smith, how much better is your offensive line? It's a little bit better, for sure. But if you still have holes at center and right guard, it's replacing those 2 players doesn't move the needle as much, right? Offensive line is all about who your worst player is, right? Because defenses are always going to find the weakness on your offensive line and attack it. They're going to blitz there. They're going to line up their best pass rusher against your worst pass blocker as much as possible to take advantage. So you need to raise the floor of your offensive line as opposed to raising the ceiling of your offensive line. You don't need to have the 5 best players at their position. You just need 5 players who are not bad at their positions. And that's where it feels like, man, if you could get a really good guard in the second round and get a special pass rusher in the first round versus a special guard in the first round and a special guard in the first round and a pretty good pass rusher in the second round, like having a special pass rusher versus a special guard, like, again, would you rather have Myles Garrett or Trey Smith, right? If you're talking about like top players at their respective positions, if that's like who makes a bigger impact on your team, obviously, a Myles Garrett type. And so that's where it becomes hard to use the 10th overall pick on a player that might just be a guard when you can find guards later on, even after the second, third round. Somebody like, USC center Jonah Monheim was Caleb Williams' center in college. I think he's a guy who could come in and, you don't necessarily want to just hand him the starting job that late in the draft, but if he's going to compete and you compete with Ryan Bates, or if you sign somebody like Drew Dahlman from the Falcons, you can develop somebody like Monheim into a starting center over the course of multiple years. He can also kick out to guard and give you some depth there. Or the two LSU guards, Miles Frazier and Garrett Dellinger, I think both have a lot of upside in the NFL. Or somebody like Willie Lampkin from North Carolina, was a combine snub, but absolutely killer tape. He's tiny. He's like 5'10", 270, but was phenomenal in college from a production standpoint. Like, you can find good players. Or small school guys like Jackson Slater from Sacramento State, I was really impressed with at the Senior Bowl. There's Clay Webb from Jacksonville State and Charles Grant from William & Mary. Like, there is plenty of interior offensive line depth in this class, and it's easier to find interior offensive line help in free agency and throughout the draft, whereas like blue chip left tackles are a little bit harder to find, and blue chip pass rushers are a bit harder to find. That's what you need to get with your first round pick if you're drafting in the top 10 there. Like, that's where you find those kind of special players. Certainly if you trade down from 10 because somebody wants to move up for somebody else and then you're in the mid-teens or whatever, okay, that's where a great guard can be more worth it. But we're talking about like a top 10 premium draft pick. The Bears don't want to be drafting in the top 10 again anytime soon. So you have to get this with a premium player that can be a long-term difference maker with your team. Not just about what you need this year, but what that player can be for the next 5 to 10. And then you can find other interior linemen later in this draft that you really, really like. Of course, there's other tackles in this draft as well, but you don't need to use a third-round pick on another offensive tackle when you just use a third-round pick on Karana Magaji last season, right? You've got Braxton Jones, Karana Magaji, and Darnell Wright. A third-round pick at offensive tackle doesn't necessarily do much for you at this point, unless they could also kick inside to guard someday. That's a different conversation. But if you're just trying to get another pure tackle, to me, you're either getting the clear upgrade over Braxton Jones or you're not really touching offensive tackle at this point, because another mid-round draft pick doesn't do that much for you. So it's a blue chip tackle at 10, or you don't really touch tackle. And if you don't see Will Campbell as a blue chip tackle, then you're not taking him at 10. And if you don't see Kelvin Banks or Armand Membou as a blue chip tackle, then you don't take him at 10. Like, at the end of the day, the arm length isn't that important in that conversation, right? It's just purely about the full evaluation of the player. Do you see them as a blue chip tackle? And arm length can be part of that evaluation, but you never go from, I thought this guy was a blue chip left tackle, his arms were 5/8 of an inch shorter, he's no longer a blue chip tackle, so I don't want him anymore. No, it's, if you have questions already and then you add in arm length questions, then that can make it more difficult. But if you had no questions, you added the arm length, he was a no questions asked guy that before, he's still got to be a no questions asked guy just because you learned what the number was. His arms didn't get shorter than what his tape was. He had the same length arms at LSU as he does right now. We just found out what that number was, and so that doesn't necessarily change much of the evaluation. And so that's where you go blue chip left tackle if that's what you see, that's what you think they are. Otherwise, you got to go elsewhere with that 10th overall pick. At the end of the day, best player available, but you want to get a premium player with a top 10 pick, and that's what the Bears need right now. They need more premium blue chip talent on their roster that can be difference-making players, and guards just aren't as much of a difference-making player, and NFL shows you that in how offensive tackles get paid more, pass rushers get paid more, pass rushers and offensive tackles are drafted earlier. Like, it's very clear how that positional value plays across the NFL. And you can, and it's great because you can still get guards later in, and the Bears can fill those needs with the picks that they have, or they can fill it in free agency and then still add guards because you want to double down on this offensive line and get young players to go with veteran free agents and keep building up that depth so it's not a weakness that it's been for seemingly my entire lifetime covering the Chicago Bears. That's hopefully a good primer for this offensive tackle draft class. Slowly, free agency in the start of the new league year is creeping up on us. It's like next week already. So we're going to go deep into free agent targets here in the next couple of days and the next week or so here on the Locked On Bears podcast. So make sure you hit the subscribe button on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts, because that's going to be the best way to keep up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. If you're looking for a second listen, don't forget to check out our Locked On NFL Draft podcast for more coverage of all of these top prospects. Damian Parson and Keith Sanchez give you the latest draft rankings, rumors, and news every day. You can find Locked On NFL Draft on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. Coming back tomorrow for another episode of Locked On Bears and another opportunity to bear down.